Hi folks, welcome to our introduction to the toxicity and deficiency and dietary sources of the macronutrients. Okay, so toxicity and deficiency. Toxicity basically means too much, whereas deficiency means too little. These terms are actually used more often in regard to micronutrients because really in regard to the macronutrients, getting deficiency and toxicity is tough because of their relationship with energy. So we may use the words overconsumption and underconsumption. They all correspond to essentially the same thing. Toxicity being too much, overconsumption being too much, and underconsumption and deficiency being too little. So alcohol is actually the most toxic macronutrient. That should come at no surprise to any of us. And that's because alcohol is converted to acetaldehyde in the liver. So overconsumption of alcohol can cause liver damage, go figure, because of where alcohol is processed, but also memory loss, worsens performance, and even death. There's no such thing as alcohol deficiency or underconsumption, so there's no reason to really advocate to consume more alcohol, although some studies suggest that moderate alcohol consumption puts you at the least amount of risk for death. Sources of alcohol really are just alcoholic beverages. There's some trace amounts of alcohol in pops and very ripe fruit and some foods where alcohol is used to cook with, but generally speaking, the more important thing here is the standard drink. When we talk about drinks or how many drinks a person had, we talk about this standard formula. It ends up being about 0.6 ounces of alcohol per standard drink. So 5% of 12 ounces or 12% of 5 ounces, or at 1.5 ounces, 40%. So these are all standard. Please use them, refer to them for other things as well. Carbohydrates can also have some overconsumption issues. Mainly it's type 2 diabetes, and it's not necessarily all carbohydrates. It seems to be simple or really sugars that are related to this increased risk. So carbohydrates essentially, because even if they're complex sugar or complex carbohydrates, they're still just a bunch of little sugars tied together. Carbohydrates will raise blood sugar. That can cause increases in inflammation and resistance to the hormone insulin, which causes sugar to be uptaken by cells, and that can result in type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes can lead to a host of other health problems. However, consuming not enough carbohydrates can make people feel a little loopy, a little weak, like they're not all there, and can result even in a condition called ketosis. And we talked about this briefly in another one of the lectures. Ketosis actually produces something called ketone bodies. And these are the other things that neurons and red blood cells can run off of when there's no carbohydrates. There's plenty of good sources of carbohydrates. I think they're a lot of our favorite foods. So bread, I love bread, rice, pasta, potatoes, right there. That's a pretty good group there, but also juices, pops, baked goods. One thing I wanted to highlight that we were just talking about on the last slide is that sugars, and it's really the hidden sources of sugars that seem to be an issue in regards to having maybe negative health effects with carbohydrate intakes. So if anything, make sure you're watching your sugar intake, particularly your added sugar intake, but in general, carbohydrates, of course, unlike alcohol, are not bad for you. They're good for you. Proteins, so overconsumption of protein is really only dangerous if you're in a particular disease state. So those with kidney function, and that's because the excess protein, as it gets degraded, that nitrogen actually needs to be excreted in urine. The urea in urine needs to be excreted. So if you have too much protein, you can cause some kidney problems if you already have some compromised kidney function. And then similarly, gluconeogenesis, the process of turning those proteins into sugars, occurs in the liver, and that can also be taxing on the liver and can cause some liver issues. Underconsumption, though, is way bigger of an issue. I have highlighted here protein malnutrition. This is the acute, very bad malnutrition that we see in developing countries where there's not enough access to good food, especially for children. It's pretty horrifying. I have a picture here to the right showing two different types of protein malnutrition. Moving on from that, because that's not, at least in the United States, it's not typically a problem we see. Rather, we see kind of chronic underconsumption of protein, which can result in a loss of muscle mass, worsened performance, and some worsened bone health, but certainly nothing as severe as protein malnutrition. Sources of proteins. Dairy products are great. I forgot eggs. Eggs are also a great source. Meats, of course. And then within vegetables, probably things that are more useful for highlighting: soy, quinoa, and rice and beans. Of course, there's ways to get full protein, even if you're vegan, from those vegetable sources. So I wanted to highlight those out. But generally speaking, good sources of proteins are usually animal-based foods. Dairy products or meats, etc. Of course, fish is another good source of protein. Okay, so moving on to fats. Fats, kind of like sugars, have other issues. They don't raise blood sugar, of course, but they do affect your blood lipid profile, which can increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, your risk of developing obesity, and then, of course, those can lead to your risk of dying. Underconsumption, though, of fats is something that I think flies under the radar much more, especially with those who are very health focused or maybe a little obsessed with exercise or physical appearance, perhaps. But underconsumption of fats can actually result in fatigue, deficiency of key fat soluble vitamins, vitamin D in particular, in addition to vitamin A. Well, all of the fat soluble vitamins, all A, D, E, and K, can have issues with if you're not eating enough fat. But then probably the bigger ones, problems with hormones. So if you're not consuming enough fats, you may have trouble producing enough testosterone and estrogen, which can lead to problems in hormone signaling. Sources of fats. Dairy products are also, again, good sources of fat. Cream, butter, those tend to be high in saturated fats, though. Oils, particularly vegetable oils, olive oil, really any sort of vegetable oil, olive oil, avocado oil, walnut oil. These oils are high in wholly unsaturated fatty acids. Meats are also, of course, high in fats, and fish actually provides some of the healthiest sources of fats, and salmon in particular is a great source of fat from fish.